depends what time you are watching this recorded lecture. So, for today, I'll discuss the American democracy, particularly involving the founding fathers of democracy or America in general. No? So, this topic is technically related with our past lesson, which is the Week 3, Part 1 American Revolution. So, basically, this Part 2 entails the aftermath or the product of the American revolutionaries' actual goal of establishing a new government. And with that, of course, the Treaty of Paris can be highlighted as a mitigating mechanism on how American democracy was first achieved through the ideas of the founding fathers and the American revolutionaries. So again, for context, the Treaty of Paris that was established or passed or signed in 1783, it officially ended the American Revolution. Of course, in where the United States secured independence from Great Britain or at present the United Kingdom. So, if we are to dissect the democratic significance or relevance of the Treaty of Paris and, of course, the American Revolution itself, we should go back to the four ideas entailed when it comes to the target democracy of the American revolutionaries. No? So, number one, we have, of course, popular sovereignty. As mentioned in the past lesson, popular sovereignty uh, refers to how the revolution embodied the idea that legitimate political authority should come from the people, not the monarchs. That's why when the American revolutionaries targeted the eradication of King George III's power and dominance over America, it showed how they didn't want that totalitarian monarchy or that absolute monarchy that is basically manifested within his governance behavior. No? And what they wanted is the type of government in where the people could choose or decide upon who or which leader they want to elect or select in governing the country because they believe that the people have the sufficient knowledge and of course the people have the actual right to choose who can govern among them. Okay, second would be or second idea would be self-governance, no? So in self-governance, again referring to how they wanted to break away from Britain, Americans rejected the taxation without representation, which we discussed before in the past lesson, referring to the Boston Tea Party and some of the events that happened in the American Revolution. So the taxation without representation, and of course the insisting of laws that must reflect the will of the governed. No? Meaning, as you know, the taxation without representation is basically the major reason why the American Revolution happened in the first place. It's majorly about economic reasons. So again, the taxation without representation does not only refer to how the policy itself or the law itself was implemented among the Americans, but rather it has something to do with the legislative representation aspect. Because again, in the Parliament of the Great Britain back then, when they were uh, dominating Americas, there wasn't any representative or there wasn't any American representative that was present when it comes to the planning or creating of laws within America. It was just purely the British people. And with that, of course, the welfare or the voices of the Americans weren't properly voiced out or they weren't properly represented within the legislative body. Okay? And next would be the Republican ideas. Because again, when it comes to Republicanism, uh, This is in line with the Treaty of Paris, no, of 1783, because the Republican ideas, it confirmed the establishment of a better or effective republic rather than a monarchy. It lays the groundwork for representative democracy. Still, really goes back to the idea of having to choose their own leader, no, and having that democratic principles of course, freedom, liberty, and among the others, which are basically the characteristics that manifest the U.S. Constitution. So another thing that you should go back to when it comes to highlighting Republican ideals is, of course, the idea of having the uh, let's say the separation of powers when it comes to the three branches of government, no, the executive, judicial, and of course the legislative. So these particular bodies or these branches, what the American revolutionaries, which are of course inspired by the idea of the enlightenment thinkers, is they did not want an overpowering or an over focusing of power in just one particular body. But instead, they wanted to be separated or divided among the three branches because not only to avoid corruption or to avoid the practice of non checks and balance, but also it's for bureaucratic efficiency, right? And lastly, of course, the American Revolution through the Treaty of Paris also highlights the importance of equality and liberty in principle. So, although not fully realized at the time during the uh, domination of Great Britain over America, slavery persisted. Women and indigenous peoples were excluded when it comes to decision making and, of course, political decisions. So, the revolution and of course the thought of the revolutionaries introduced democracy as a guiding ideal, which of course forms freedom, independence, and of course the citizens shaping their own political destiny. So basically, the US Constitution at present really embodies the idea of having equality for all, whatever race, whatever nationality, whatever color you have. Although by practice, we know that this can be hypocrite. No, it could be a part of a very Hippocratic type of behavior because even the U.S. president himself, Donald Trump, does not really embrace anymore the idea of equality, but rather it's making America great again. And by by recognizing making America great again, he only wanted to emphasize the importance or the welfare of the whites rather than other people of color or race. Okay, but again, the revolutionaries, since they have been politically traumatized by the absolute monarchy rule of King George III, it was just rational for them to basically produce an idea of having equality and liberty as a core principle within their wanted democracy or written democracy among their land. So, in this perspective, if we are to provide a summary about how the Treaty of Paris or the American Revolution came to be as a shaping mechanism or event in the establishing of American democracy in general, it emerges as the political outcome of a struggle for independence and, of course, translating revolutionary ideals into sovereignty and the right to self to rule. Okay, so moving forward, so if we were to ask ourselves, what is American democracy in our own or your own understanding? Okay, so what we should go back to, not besides the Treaty of Paris and the American revolutionaries plan or dream for America, we should actually look at the colonial foundations that happened again in America, no, highlighting again the importance of the American Revolution up to the Treaty of Paris. So the colonists became accustomed to local autonomy despite British oversight. No, so even before the American Revolution happened, it was already clear for many Americans or Native Americans how they wanted to set free or to set apart America from the actual governance rule of King George III and of course Great Britain. And with that, it draws on the idea that colonialism, particularly in the aspect of Great Britain, does not really entail or is an opposite of how democracy came as both a concept and a practice. Because again, the type of government that the American revolutionaries wanted, it is far different of how the ideology of Great Britain was back then. Okay? Although at present we could see some of the similarities when it comes to the international arena behavior of Great Britain, or sorry, of United Kingdom and the United States of America. They both resemble neoliberal policies when it comes to trade, when it comes to diplomatic practices. They both attend United Nations, or of course also they engaged with non-Western countries when it comes to diplomatic relations. So these are things that have changed among how the colonial foundations was, particularly from 1607 to 1775. And another area of understanding that we could highlight when it comes to understanding American democracy is how the Articles of Confederation, particularly from 1781 to 1789, came to be. So, the first US Constitution emphasized the idea or concept of state sovereignty and weak central government. So, in the Articles of Confederation, it was already a product of the American revolutionaries and the founding fathers of democracy, of American democracy, of how they wanted to, uh, let's say, itemize or to further elaborate what is sovereignty, what is democracy, what is freedom in terms of concept, no? But how to basically institutionalize these concepts might have been a very difficult thing for them in the first place, given that they were used to the British rule and the British laws that was imposed among them forcefully. And of course, what we should also highlight within the Articles of Confederation is, of course, the failures, no? Its failures when it comes to inability to tax, when it comes to weakness to defense, and these things that manifest within the national authority that has to be changed. So the Articles of Confederation was basically is an experiment. We could actually consider it as an experiment because in the early years of the Articles of Confederation, it was a weak. At the same time, it wasn't so much of an effectively planned out type of constitution that manifested within America. Okay, so moving forward, when the Articles of Confederation again, which started or which was written in 1781, in the constitutional framework of the U.S., which emerged from 1787 to 1789, the U.S. Constitution created or established the what we call the federal system. So as you know, the federal system is one of the biggest highlights or characteristic of the US Constitution. Because again, federalism manifests within their states, within their total of 50 states in America. So when they created the federal system through the constitutional framework or the US Constitution, of course, it lied or it embodied the separation of powers and the checks and balances. Because what the US Constitution wanted to embrace is that even though there is a separate organized power decentralization among the 50 states of America, is that these states, these 50 states, should not forget their obligation and of course their priority of securing the country when it comes to national security, foreign policies, or national policies, when it comes to trade, when it comes to diplomatic relations, because these things basically represent the national performance of America when it comes to the international arena. Okay, but when it comes to the US Constitution, there is or there are some compromises, some great compromise, no? So, as you know, when the US Constitution began or when it was first established, it did not balance representation. It compromised representation. It actually revealed a lot of tensions when it comes to slavery and equality and color, because we have seen how only the white men and women would be able to just participate in politics when it comes to businesses, enterprises, of course, which let down or left out as well the black Americans who weren't really so much of appreciated as part of the US citizenship back then in America. Okay? And besides that, what should be highlighted in the early US Constitution of 1787 is the uh, let's say the debates, no? The debates or ratification of debates between two factions. We have the Federalist and the Anti-Federalist, which actually shape understanding of democracy and rights. So yung mga Federalist pati yung mga Anti-Federalist, they have a very opposite notion when it comes to the implementation of federalism in the American territories or the territorial lands. So yung mga federalists, of course, they would believe that decentralization or separation of powers among the 50 states were necessary because again, they think that each state has their own independent or unique sociocultural background, historical foresight that are only bound to them in their own state. And with that, it entails an implementation of federalism in their constitution para magkaroon ng independent and strong government yung each state. On the other hand, yung mga anti-federalist naman, they believe that there should be a unison or a united perspective when it comes to the 50 states. And they did not want any separation or any decentralization of power among the 50 states. Okay? So these particular debates or ideologies between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were basically a huge contribution when it comes to the shaping of the US Constitution in 1787. Because again, if we are to go back to the US Constitution at present, we would see that democracy in America shows how each of the people coming from different races, colors, have their own collective decision making when it comes to elections, at the same time when it comes to economic decisions in America. And with that, it showed the balance between the perspective or the let's say the opinions of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, because they were able to really hear out or to apply what these two factions have to say in shaping the understanding of democracy and rights in the U.S. Constitution. Right. So next highlight about American democracy is of course directly the Bill of Rights, which was established in 1791. So the Bill of Rights is one of the first 10 amendments that was basically guaranteed among the fundamental civil liberties of America, particularly freedom of speech, freedom of religion, press, assembly, and the due process. So the Bill of Rights of 1791 technically institutionalized protections against tyranny, particularly ensuring that each individual freedoms are protected within democracy. Because in America, they don't want another emergence of a uh, tyrannic leader who would basically abuse the foundations of democracy, no? Because again, they were traumatized by their past from the domination or the colonization of the Europeans, particularly the Great Britain. And the Bill of Rights ensures that every individual is again protected in terms of how they want to go against, how they want to speak against the government if ever that the government does not really practice that democratic ideology that it promised to practice. Okay, so again, in relation to democracy, pagka na-mention natin ang democracy of America, of course, we highlight suffrage or the right to vote. So, the expansion of suffrage manifested from the US Constitution, from the 1787 Constitution. And of course, it started with a very limited recognition when it comes to uh, voting decisions. And it was only limited to white or property owning men. Remember? So we had what we call the passive and of course the active citizens during the uh, reign of Great Britain and of course the early parts of the Constitution. So the initial limitations when it comes to men or white men only voting, or of course, these men having an ownership for them to vote, sets the actual development on how voting is practiced in America at present. It has shown or showed a great difference or a huge development when it comes to how even the non-original U.S. citizens could also vote during national elections. Huh? So if you are to highlight how it developed, the the 1820s or the 1830s period of America is basically a very important highlight in highlighting the expansion of suffrage in America. Because dito pumasok yung yung Jacksonian democracy, because the Jacksonian democracy, which I will highlight in the next lessons, it expanded voting rights to nearly all white men, because the Jacksonian democracy basically is a very white-centered type of democracy. But again, we are talking about the early stages of suffrage pa in America. But when it had, or when American democracy and the uh, U.S. Constitution had an amendment in 1870, it had what we call the 15th Amendment. So yung 15th Amendment ng US Constitution, particularly when it comes to suffrage, it enfranchised black men, although it was restricted by Jim Crow laws, which was of course a very anti-black population type of laws. So yung mga black men, they were able to also vote. But again, the black men should have particular economic, let's say, properties or economic capacities for them to vote. So it was a huge development back then, but again, if we are to look at equality as a concept, it wasn't still attained in 1870. On the other hand, when another amendment came to being in 1920, there was what we call the 19th Amendment naman. So this particular amendment granted women the right to vote. So in this part, hindi na selective when it comes to uh, the population of black men, or when it comes to the population of white men when it comes to economic capacities. But the 19th Amendment also embraced all genders, no? Meaning, of course, women, even though they're not as economically privileged, they were also allowed to vote at this time. And of course, the next development that manifested when it comes to American suffrage is the civil rights movement, particularly in the aspect of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So it was a huge gap between 1920 to 1965. And between this period, maraming particular activists at the same time, social movements that happened for the civil rights movement to really happen and produce the Voting Rights Act. So, the Voting Rights Act, ang na-highlight dito, it's not only about the gender, let's say, barriers that manifested, or it wasn't only the gender barriers that was dismantled, but also the racial barriers to suffrage. Meaning, either you're Latin American, even you're Asian, or sabihin natin you're part of some of the ano no, the poorest of the poorest national identities, you could actually vote or participate in politics, no? So the civil rights movement was seen as the most significant or the most impactful development of American suffrage. And we should not also forget the 26th Amendment of 1971. So the 26th Amendment of the US Constitution when it comes to American suffrage, it actually lowered voting age to 18, no? Because it used to be I think 25 or 21 back in 1965. So when it lowered the voting age to 18, of course, more Americans were able to vote or to participate politically. Kasi na dagdagan or lumaki yung scope ng age limit when it comes to voting or right to suffrage. Okay, so there are a lot more of things or there are a lot of components or topics that we could actually highlight when it comes to understanding American democracy. But I just provided the major or the most important points that could be associated with this concept. But let us further define what is American democracy based on American literature. Right, so according to Stoughton Wood, 1999, he actually defined democracy as a mean to the protection of individual liberties and rights. What Stoughton Wood wanted to emphasize with this actual definition is that without the protection of individual liberties and rights, we could not, or America could not, also establish or practice voting and participation in government. Kumbaga, tinitingnan ni Wood tong individual liberties and rights as starting points for the Americans to actually have a particular role and participation within the American society and economy. And without voting, without participation, may it be in politics or in the economy, democracy itself, or American democracy itself, would be essentially meaningless. At ang another argument ni Wood when it comes to American democracy, so he quoted that people as judges in their own causes. What Wood wanted to emphasize in this particular phase is that American democracy is basically a system in which the people do not merely choose legislators or executives, but rather, in effect, become judges in their own causes. That is, of course, they assess and decide disputes in their own interest. So, kumbaga, tinitignan ni Wood that yung capacity ng mga Americans to actually choose or elect their own politicians is basically already a source of power. And it could be a potential threat because the decision of people when it comes to choosing their own politicians, when it comes to having their own legislators, it could basically manifest or it could provide the risk of bias, faction, and self-interest. At kung titignan natin, even though the people of America have that particular political suffrage or right to vote, is that at the end of the day, these decisions could only manifest biases and self-interest. And with that, it is a scary part or component for American democracy. Because how could we really know if the people could practice or state their democratic opinions in a morally inclined way? Or is morality really the case? Or is it really a question of morality? Because again, the whole point of democracy is to hear, it's to represent what the majority of people has to say when it comes to having their own or selecting their own leaders. Second would be democracy may be identified with equality, with feelings of sameness between people. But class, what we should take note of is that even though equality is a good thing, a manifestation of democratic framework or ideology, is that sameness between people does not always 100% of the time equate to rightness. Because again, it could happen that in one particular state or community, there is a group of people who share the same sentiment or opinion, but it is not validated constitutionally or it is not validated morally, no? So, but rather, equity can be a better alternative rather than equality. So, ang sabi ni Wood, isa ito sa mga strength at the same time weakness ng democracy of America. So, ang argument ni Wood is that democracy could entail to dangers of excess. So from the start, Americans were basically worried about too much democracy, no? Meaning the dangers that popular passions, popular sovereignty, o kaya sabihin natin factional competition, yung differences between political parties, and of course, private interests could also take place when it comes to dominating public life. The problem was how to allow popular decision making without allowing reckless or unjust majoritarian impulses. Because again, majoritarian impulses, it does not fully entail or show rightfulness. Okay? And it is a challenge even up to the present day how democracy could be, let's say, barriered or limited if it has to be limited. Okay? And lastly, according to Wood, democracy is far more than a mere matter of people having the right to vote, which is, of course, a self explanatory thing. Because when it comes to American democracy, it is not only limited to political suffrage or the right to suffrage. It has something to do with the people, with the institutions, and the practices that are entailed within this written constitution. Because again, in American democracy, we don't only want to limit its actual idea and concept with political participation. Although political participation is seen as the forefront of American democracy, but again, it has something to do with a lot of things, particularly in the institutions, no? And if I were to basically share my own idea, it should manifest merely on the separation of powers within the three branches. Okay? So, in the case of the judiciary, ang sinabi kasi ni Wood or ni Stoughton Wood about American democracy, his core argument mentioned that The judiciary became the principal institutional device by which Americans constrained the more volatile impulses of legislative majorities. Ang reason is that the courts were relatively removed from daily partisan pressures, but they could, in theory, impartially advocate among contending interests, protecting minority rights against the interest-mongering popular legislatures. Kumbaga, ang gustong sabihin ni Wood is that the judiciary should be protected or it could be empowered, but it should not limit itself within only the Americans or the white Americans, but rather also the minorities. Because the thing is, in a revolutionary, or sorry, in the majority perspective or the majoritarian perspective, there is a possibility of only focusing the laws or shaping the laws within the notion of the white Americans, especially in the early stages of American Constitution in the 1787 up to the late 1800s. It was only within the 1900s or the late 1800s in where the idea of equality was first established. Okay, so another thing that was manifested within the concept of democracy shared by Wood is the debate or the argument between democratic ideology versus democratic practice. So, when it comes to democratic ideology and democratic practice, Wood emphasizes the tension between these two ideas, the ideology and practice. So, Americans believed deeply in the ideal of popular rule, that government derives from the people or the decision and opinion of the people. Yet, pagdating sa practice, they also feared the unfettered majority right might lead to injustice or tyranny. Because again, some majoritarian decisions or some majoritarian rule could possibly lead to tyranny if not filtered or checked properly when it comes to their belief or political ideology. Thus, there is a challenge, no, that Wood wanted to emphasize that how to make, quote unquote, the people as judges, no, worked in a dispersed, large-scale republic without devolving into chaos or factional tyranny. Kumbaga, since Wood mentioned earlier sa may phrase niya na quote unquote, people as judges in their own causes. How could the US Constitution legally limit the people from leading into tyranny or that volatile type of government? So, even up to the present day, even though meron ng checks and balances na tinatawag, it is still not so clear how the majoritarian rule could be basically limited or checked by the Constitution and the legislators themselves. So it leads us to a certain question, since democracy or American democracy has a lot of flaws associated to it. So what pushed America to develop or to improve democracy as both a concept and a practice? Okay, so what we should go back to again is the historical roots that America have, no? So number one, of course, it's the rejection of monarchy and arbitrary power. Meaning, we go back to the reality of America experiencing the rule or the actual regime of King George III, in where his authority and the idea of unchecked power was largely implemented. So, when it comes to King George III, or in relation to King George III, the revolution basically instilled the belief that sovereignty should rest with the people, not a distant or an external monarchy or aristocracy that was basically manifested in King George III's rule or authority. Another thing about rejecting monarchy and arbitrary powers that uh, the revolutionaries or the Americans were basically rejecting of the idea of hereditary rule that was basically laid the foundation of popular sovereignty or nag-cause ito ng idea ng popular sovereignty. Because again, in hereditary rule, just like that is manifested in the concept of political dynasties, there should always be a choice of better leaders at the same time other options when it comes to selecting leaders that could be seated within the government because they believe that if there is too much or there is a practice of hereditary rule, it wouldn't be productive, it wouldn't be efficient for the American government because it would always be the same group of family, same group of people who would govern the American government. And with that, there would no be developments, there will no be changes in the type of government that they want to see, no? Lalo at ang American government is something that is far evolving, no? Every uh, term or every election that it carries out. So another area that pushed American democracy um, to develop or American democracy sought to develop is of course the taxation without representation. So the taxation without representation, particularly through the British taxes like the Stamp Act, as you recall, the Tea Act or the Townshend Acts, it actually angered colonists who had no voice in parliament. Okay? So the slogan, no taxation without representation, became a rallying cry. Besides being a rallying cry, it became a huge representation of how the American revolutionaries wanted to set themselves free from the rule of King George III. But this particular phrase or this rallying cry did not only focus on unfair taxation, but also the political representation and self-rule, which of course resulted or pushed for democratic ideals. Okay, and last one. So another thing that pushed for the development of the democracy in America is of course the inspiration from what we call the Enlightenment ideas. Babalik na naman tayo sa Enlightenment ideas. So of course, yung mga thinkers na na-mention natin from the past lesson, like John Locke, Montesquieu, and Rousseau, influenced the revolutionaries. No? Pero mainly, they were basically, uh, let's say, seen as inspirations because the idea of Locke's natural rights like life, liberty, property, and of course the social contract and the Declaration of Independence that was pushed by pushed by John Locke again, of course. It manifested a huge change or an inspiration on how they could build their constitution. Besides that, of course, you also have Montesquieu's separation of powers, which shaped the constitution when it comes to having the three branches. And of course, promulgating the checks and balances and the limitations to power. Okay, the Enlightenment thought made democracy seem rational, just, and necessary. But again, it's a challenge even in the present US Constitution if they are truly practicing what was imbibed within the Enlightenment ideas shared by the thinkers that we mentioned. Okay, so let's now delve on the American democracy or the American politics in general in the 1700s. So what we should look into in the 1700s is how unorganized or disorganized it was and how it was basically dominated by informality. So in the 1700s, mostly manifested practice back then was of course, number one would be personal patronage, because personal patronage dominated colonial society, and this alone made it something other than a democratic society. So, the idea of having a personal patronage as one of the mitigating characteristics of American politics in 1700s, it showed how there wasn't any checks and balances and any carrying of democratic ideologies was back then in the government institutions of America. Meaning, it was largely influenced by the economic policies that was implemented by the British rule. Kumbaga, ang American government was largely utilized when it comes to taxes, when it comes to economic burdens imbibed by the British rule. That was, of course, showing how the American revolutionaries were triggered or weren't comfortable by the implementations imbibed by the British rule. Okay? And particularly if you are to look at the events that transpired in American politics in the 1700s, we could use what happened in Boston, particularly in the decades of 1720s, and where only 30% of elections were contested. And by the 1750s, 60% were. Meaning, in Boston, since it was limited only to white men, what you should recall from this time is that hindi lahat ng mga boto ng mga white men, even though they pay their taxes, they have their own properties, is hindi lahat ng binibigay nilang boto was basically transpired or shared within the election decision back then. Meaning, sobrang baba ng voter turnout, at the same time, the voting results were practically biased or controlled by the government. So besides that, American politics, it was self-intensifying, meaning social authority created political power, which in turn created more social influence. Meaning, in the time of 1700s, uh, the social authority in America back then wasn't so much of collectively focused. Masyado siyang masyado siyang self-interest bias, at the same time self-interest focused, in a way that there are only selected leaders who would actually thought of the collective good. And we have seen that how the British people or the British government only centered their policies for the benefit of the British rule, and not those Americans who they saw who were struggling financially and economically. And lastly, social authority and political authority coincide, because when you speak of social authority back then in the 1700s, we are talking about influence, because in 1700s, the British rule, they would usually go around within the uh, states, the first early states of America, and they would basically gain trust from the American people, and they would use this as a political tool when it comes to garnering political support, in which they would use when it comes to having a seat within the legislative body. Even though there was no representation when it comes to the Americans back then, because the British people were the only ones seated within the parliament. But again, some Americans would still support the British rule, no? And I believe that social authority and political authority coincide on that aspect, because we have seen how the British people would again utilize, at the same time abuse their social influences over the American public. Right, so moving forward. So now that we are in the present state or the present status of American democracy as both a concept and a practice, The US Constitution, as mentioned in Stanford University 2012, it provides a strong legal framework that basically ensures government operate according to established laws, not the whims of individuals. This creates stability and limits arbitrary use of power. So we go back to the legislative branch or the Congress of the United States. So basing from the US Constitution, the main role of the legislative branch is to create or make the laws. And through the House of Representatives, which is of course the lower house of the U.S. Congress, it represents the people directly, with of course having the seats apportioned by population. On the other hand, the Senate, on the other aspect, represents the states equally, ensuring the balance between large and small states. So yung purpose ng power ng legislative branch promulgates within the strong legal framework it embodies. Because again, the House of Rep and the Senate, similar to the Philippines, we we as a country only function, or our government function on the legal frameworks that are created or decided by the legislative branch. And for its purpose, of course, it's to embody popular sovereignty, no? Kasi yung mga batas or yung mga laws, they come from elected representatives of the people. And of course, to check the executive, because the executive, there is a possibility of abuse of power when it comes to the president and the vice president. Kaya itong legislative body, it embraces the power or the practice of impeachment, of course, approving appointments and declaring war, o kaya yung mga controlling of budget, which are very important because these things are seen as the largest components of state decisions. And besides that, the legislative branch or the Congress of the US, it ensure laws are basically deliberated and debated among the members of the Congress. And they avoid having it dictated by one authority. Okay? Alright, so second one, the healthy democratic systems feature competing visions of a good society, meaning that competition can be beneficial for society as a whole. What we mean by this is that given that America, with its 50 states, they have their own popular sovereignty and they have their own federal identity as a government. And with that, when it comes to competition, may it be political and economic, that shares or that leads to a healthy, beneficial society for the whole America. But if I were to define a good America, I think we should go back to the role of the executive branch, in where it is reflected by the president, the vice president, and of course, some of the cabinet members. So the main role of the executive branch is of course to enforce the law, no? Because the legislative branch, they make the laws. So when the executive branch enforce the law, it is of course headed by the president himself, because he could basically sign or approve the laws. So the president, he manifests largely how a state or how a society can come present itself as a good or bad. Okay? So the president, who serves as the commander-in-chief, at the same time the chief diplomat and the head of state, he represents the majority of the country's image in the international arena. So pagdating sa purpose naman ng power ng executive branch, of course, number one, it's to provide energy and leadership in executing laws or in implementing laws. Since legislatures are slow and deliberative, it is the role of the executive branch to make sure that when it comes to implementation of laws, smooth at forward looking na yung mangyayari when it comes to its deliberation. Besides that, ang executive branch, as you know, ang president yun nagsiserve as the representation when it comes to foreign affairs. So if in the diplomatic practices that the president shows is hindi tayo ganun ka-productive, is of course, it would look like hindi tayo diplomatic or hindi tayo cooperative na country. And that shows if we are a participative or we are a non-participative country. Next would be, of course, ensuring unity in diplomacy because, again, the United States, as part of the United Nations and some part of the civil society organizations, it has that particular role of ensuring that we maintain those relations as much as they can. Because democracy, by concept, it shows how cooperating at the same time diplomatic it is by nature. And another thing that the executive branch can do or has a particular purpose is to check the legislature through veto power, preventing hasty and unjust laws. So if the legislative branch proposes a particular law within the whole nation, it can be vetoed or it can be rejected by the executive branch, especially if it's not constitutional or it does not abide by the principle of the US Constitution of freedom, liberty, and equality. And besides that, the executive branch, it has the role to balance judicial independence by, of course, appointing judges, which are, of course, within the Senate approval, no? Because the judges come from different areas of the country, different states, different bodies of government, and these judges have that particular say when it comes to judicial decisions. Okay? So in relation, of course, we have the other branch of government, which is the judicial branch, no? Supreme Court and the federal courts, and where, of course, the legal and the let's say the trial components of the government are manifested. So the main role of the judicial branch is to more of interpret the law. Kung si legislative, it's to make, si executive, it's to enforce, si judicial naman, it's to basically interpret. So when it comes to interpreting the law, they ensure that they comply within the Constitution, or the judicial branch could basically interpret the law as something that's constitutional or unconstitutional. So when it comes to the judicial branch, it is seen as the neutral arbiter, meaning it protects the rights and it resolves disputes under the law through the Supreme Court and some trial or federal courts. So ang ginagawa din ng judicial branch, it's to actually check legislative and executive actions through what we call judicial review. So yung judicial review na to, it was actually established by a particular case in the Constitution called the Marbury and Madison 1803. So dyan first na-establish yung judicial review in where there should be a process of understanding the particular laws that are basically passed by the judicial body. And besides that, the judicial branch also has a role to safeguard minority rights against majority abuses. Meaning, pag sinabi natin minority rights, it could be the immigrants, it could be the people of color, the blacks, the Asians, or any nationalities or races that may come to be. Because in the Constitution, meron ng protection from possible discrimination at abuse ang mga minorities from the white or the majoritarian population of America. Right, and lastly, um, I think what we could highlight as well about American democracy, when it comes to its overall purpose, it's of course the overall balance that is manifested within the whole notion of American Constitution. So, what you should remember is that in the American Constitution, yung checks and balances system is the most important because the whole point of the overall checks and balances is no branch can dominate. So each has its own mechanism to resist overreach by the others, meaning it could veto, it could practice impeachment if there is abuse of power, and of course, it can do judicial review. And with that, tong particular processes na to, it avoids the overreach of power by a particular leader or any branch from the three that we mentioned. And with that, the checks and balances, it also shows flexibility and stability when it comes to political structure or power structure because it prevents sudden radical shifts in power while allowing gradual change. Kumbaga, open when it comes to amendments, when it comes to constitutional changes, yung US Constitution. Lalo pag kami nakikita silang against dun sa may core liberties of liberty, equality, and of course, freedom within the U.S. Constitution or any proposed laws that may come to be. What makes American democracy the most quote-unquote successful constitutionally? So this particular question is actually debated among Western scholars and non-Western scholars because American democracy, in relation to the U.S. Constitution, is believed to be the first constitution in the international arena that has actually adopted the principles of democracy as something that is applying to vote their political participation, when it comes to their civil rights, when it comes to their minority rights, and whatsoever. But there are a lot of factors that makes the U.S. Constitution, particularly the first Constitution of 1787 of U.S., that makes it a huge viable example of a successful constitution with democratic principles. So when it comes to the U.S. Constitution of 1787, which has been in effect for over 230 years or more, it is considered to be the oldest written national constitution that is still in use. Marami rin siyang ano, no? Na-survive na wars like the Civil War, the World Wars, and of course, the World War itself. The economic crisis like the Great Depression or the hyperinflation, and of course, a lot of social upheavals in which, of course, the Constitution did not collapse. Besides that, yung endurance din ng US Constitution, it gives a global prestige as a model for constitutional democracy for other countries. Like for Asian countries in Southeast Asia, of course, we have the Philippines in general, and of course, we have South Korea, in which, of course, it looks at the US Constitution as a good democratic framework or basis. So besides that, a good highlight about the 1787 U.S. Constitution and of course the present one is its actual highlight of the checks and balances. Again, we always go back to the checks and balances, no, because the U.S. Constitution is the first constitution to ever implement the separation of powers that, of course, manifests within the three branches. Because the whole point of this is to avoid tyranny or the overuse of power in one particular government body. So each branch has tools to limit each other. Like na-mention ko kanina yung presidential veto, yung congressional oversight or overview, and yung judicial review na tinatawag. So this structure makes the system resilient against authoritarian or corruption drifts that can take place if there is an over focus of power in one branch. Okay, what makes the U.S. Constitution successful democratically and constitutionally is, of course, its content within the Bill of Rights that was adopting the first 10 amendments in the 1791. Kasi yung sa may first 10 amendments ng Bill of Rights and Civil Liberties ng US Constitution, it enshrined fundamental freedoms such as na-mention natin kanina yung speech, press, freedom in religion, assembly, pati yung due process. So, this particular components. So, yung protection sa mga areas na to became like the benchmarks or indicators for human rights globally. Like what we hear from the United Nations, from the ILO, at the same time some NGOs like the ICRC, the Greenpeace, so these particular institutions, they adopt these amendments as particular indicators if they have basically practiced the neoliberal and democratic principles that they want to enshrine among the involved countries that they have. Okay? So besides that, the Bill of Rights and Civil Liberties also highlight the later amendments that expanded into democracy, such as abolition of slavery, particularly in the Black American population, and of course, we have the women's suffrage, which we have discussed in Europe as something that has evolved over time during the no, the aftermath of the French Revolution. And of course, voting rights for all races, which is very important because a particular immigrant should have the same voting right or participation in another country that he or she transferred to because he or she experiences the same political and economic effects as to the original citizens that may live there. And of course, it's the lowering of voting age into 18 years old, which is also applied here in the Philippines. So this particular achievements by the Bill of Rights and Civil Liberties have manifested as important components of how we could see the 1787 and the present U.S. Constitution has successfully imbibe the democracy that it should, no? All right. So moving forward, in the American democratic landscape, the going back again to the aspect of the U.S. American Constitution, we could also highlight the democracy and promotion of human rights in relation to the Bill of Rights, of course. So if you are to scan the U.S. Constitution, particularly in the Bill of Rights, Article 1 states that the peoples of the Americas have a right to democracy and their governments have an obligation to promote and defend it. It also states that democracy is essential for the social, political, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas. If you are to analyze or to dissect this particular Article 1, from the actual notion of the Americas having a right to democracy and their governments to have an obligation to promote and defend it, is what we mean by this. It has something to do with their actual laws. No? Yung mga ginagawa nilang mga batas, it should always manifest the characteristic of democracy. And it should not discriminate, it should not divide, and it should not be biased in one particular race or group only. Because their idea of democracy manifests within the practice of equality. Okay? So it's not only limited to social or political aspects. Democracy has something to do with economic development, particularly in the areas of trade, no? Because in the US Constitution, the practice of trade, may it be in the national or international aspect, recognizes the idea that a democracy or democratic country should imbibe the economic development in a way that people are given the chance to practice any economic practices that they want. Okay? Okay, so let's now move on to the founding of American democracy. So, if we actually delve or we go back to the founding of American democracy, we would usually just tackle the founding or the founders of American democracy, which of course highlight Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington. We also have John Jay. We also have Alexander Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, and among the others, which we will highlight later. But before we delve on that, we should look at what happened in September 17, 1787. So this is considered to be a very important gathering of men in a particular closed meeting. And this is what we call the Constitutional Convention of 1787. Kumbaga, ito yung tinatawag na greatest vision of human freedom in history. So what happened in a particular local or event place called the Pennsylvania's State House, now called the Independence Hall. So this particular men thought of creating ideas and new approaches to the US Constitution in where it should manifest democratic and freedom mechanisms for the people. So it started, of course, if we go back constitutionally, it started with the Second Continental Congress, which we discussed earlier on, which was adopted in 1781 by the 13 states or the earliest states of America. So, yung Second Continental Congress that we have discussed earlier on, it reflected the colonists' fear of strong centralized authority that was practiced by King George III because of their experience with the British monarchy and the parliament that was not involving the American people. Besides that, the Articles created a League of Friendship where states retain their sovereignty, freedom, and independence. Okay? So in relation to the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin made a particular motion amongst the other men to sign the document in his last great speech. Kumbaga, minention ni Benjamin Franklin how the US Constitution manifested the core ideas of independence, liberty, freedom, and it would change the whole landscape of the American government and political systems. And with that, dito nag-start yung new form of government that we call as the Republican government that replaced yung weak central government established by the Articles of Confederation that was manifested in the Second Continental Congress of 1777. So the Republican government is considered to be the new government that we call it. Okay? So this is dito nag-emerge yung Constitutional Convention na tinatawag natin. So the Constitutional Convention was an event that was a decision of how America was going to be governed. Okay? So although the convention had been officially called to revise the Articles of Confederation, many delegates had much bigger plans. So remember, the Articles of Confederation was seen to be a weak or stagnant approach when it comes to the Constitution of America. That's why it shifted into the Constitutional Convention, in where they saw a more ladderized, a more organized aspect or belief of how they would basically feel or they would basically embody the federal government because they believe that the transition marks the US shift from a confederation into a federal republic, which was more representing of the states. Okay? So again, just to compare again the Articles of Confederation from 1781 to 1789. So the Articles of Confederation, it is the first written constitution of the US, which was again adopted during the American Revolution noong 1777 and ratified in 1781. So yung nature ng Articles of Confederation, why it was weak, is that it has a loose confederation for the sovereign states with a weak central government. Kasi ang gustong iparating ng Federal Republic is that even though it had the decentralized federal mechanism of government towards the states, is that meron pa rin siyang strong centralized government na nagpo-focus dun sa national security, sa economic policies, sa diplomatic practices, and whatsoever. Sorry, give me 1 minute break. I will just get my charger. Right, going back to the features or the characteristics of the Articles of Confederation from 1781 and 1789, and why it was considered to be a weak or loose first type of constitution in the US. So its features revolve around that each state had one vote in Congress regardless of its size, which is unreasonable because again, we are talking about the differences, the geographical and population differences of each of the state in America. And it's not fair to have one voting capacity or voting uh, chance for each state regardless of their size and population. And this is where the Constitutional Convention made it change or changed it because it stated that each state should have an equalizer when it comes to how many of their population versus or how big is their population versus how many voting capacities or voting numbers could they provide when it comes to the decisions in federal legislations, which is really reasonable in a sense. Okay. So second characteristic of the Articles of Confederation is that no executive branch or no president or no national judiciary. Okay? So, with this, pagka walang president kasi, of course, there is no central government. So, pagka walang executive body, there is no representation of its cabinet members. And with that, it could be a chaotic or disorganized type of government. So, another feature or characteristic of the Articles of Confederation is Congress would conduct foreign affairs. They would also make treaties. They could declare war and manage Native American relations, which was really, really impractical at that time. Because, come to think of it, the Congress should only focus on the legislative matters. But rather, yung mga roles ng foreign affairs, when it comes to approving the treaties or declaring war, dapat assigned na to dun sa executive body. Kasi magkakaroon ng overreach or magkakaroon ng overloading task itong si Congress. And legislative matters could not be created properly or systematically, which was evident during the time of the American Revolution. Kasi nakita natin na hindi talaga organized at the same time hindi properly represented yung mga legislations noon. It was too selective in a matter na only the white Americans could benefit from it, not the minorities. And another thing that the uh, Articles of Confederation came to be or what it can do is that it could not tax or regulate interstate or foreign commerce. Meaning it relied on states on funding, particularly pagdating sa free trade, no? So sa free trade at that time masyado silang dependent sa idea na it could only be done within the national jurisdiction or national territory without considering yung mga ginagawang overseas trading at the same time yung sabihin nating multilateral trading agreements. So isa kasi ito sa mga nagpapalawig or nagpapalakas ng international economic position ng isang bansa. And of course, given that the Constitutional Convention was more of in the neoliberal approach, it allowed US to further expand internationally when it comes to commerce. Right? So, moving forward to the Constitutional Convention or the CONCON of 1787. So, it is seen to be a more, sabihin nating, effective, at the same time, flexible type of approach. And where, of course, as mentioned here, it would be the greatest vision of human freedom in history. And what we mean by that is it would change the whole landscape for America. And that is also supported by Benjamin Franklin. Okay, so, sorry, going back there pala. So, with the characteristics of the Constitutional Convention in relation to the Articles of Confederation, let me reiterate it to you. So, the delegates from the 12 states, except Rhode Island met in Philadelphia, particularly to revise the Articles of Confederation. So ang ginawa dito or ang purpose nito was to amend at the same time yung mga delegates like sila Madison, Hamilton, Washington, Franklin as the uh, actual founding fathers, they created an entirely new framework. Kumbaga, the US Constitution itself. No? So, the US Constitution, it replenishes, it changes the mistakes or the past lacking components of the Articles of Confederation. So, ang pinaka naging key debates or mga naging changes dito sa may constitutional convention na to is of course, number one, the representation. Na-mention natin kanina na dun sa may Confederation or Articles of Confederation, each state only had one vote in Congress regardless of its size or population. So pagdating sa representation, dito sa may Constitutional Convention or CONCON, nagkaroon ng great compromise. Kumbaga nagkaroon ng bicameral legislature, meaning House by population, Senate equal representation, which is of course a good equalizer when it comes to state voting, no? Besides that, the Constitutional Convention also highlighted or manifested the idea or the concept of slavery. So, meron tayong tinatawag na three-fifths compromise, meaning counting enslaved people partly for representation or taxes. So, even though slavery wasn't so much of eradicated yet during this time in 1700s, is nagkaroon na ng ng parang contributing factor yung mga slaves when it comes to voting decisions for each state. And each state, back then, lalo sa Long Island, at the same time, in the areas of New York, meron silang differences kasi when it comes to their practices of slavery. Yung iba hindi ganun kadami ang slaves, yung iba sobrang daming slaves. And with that, the three-fifths compromise has led to involving the enslaved people when it comes to voting. Okay? But it has something to do with their taxing standing as well. Okay? So, next would be the executive power. Yung executive power pagdating sa Constitutional Convention of 1787, it agreed on a single president, but it had or it used to have established the checks and balances. Kumbaga kahit meron ng centralized power pagdating sa uh, checks and balances, lahat yan manifested within the three branches. Kumbaga, each branches have to make sure that yung mga counter or yung equivalent branches nila would not practice overdoing of powers or roles within the US government. Okay? And lastly, federalism. So the CONCON, it actually allowed for sharing of powers between states and national government, meaning the executive level, the legislative level, and judiciary level, they could intervene within the federal states or the federal governments that are transmitted within each state in America, the 50 states. But at the end of the day, when it comes to internal affairs, when it comes to socio-cultural aspects, each of the state have their own individual or independent decisions. Okay? So this is the signing of the Constitution of the United States or the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So, bigyan ko lang kayo ng context on what happened on this particular event. So, after independence, actually nagkaroon ng si US, no? Nagkaroon siya ng Articles of Confederation which we have discussed earlier on. But the Articles of Confederation was far too weak. It was not that organized according to the founding fathers of America. And ayun nga, nagkaroon ng problems with the articles because it lacked emphasis on equal representation when it comes to slavery, when it comes to the existence of the executive body. So, with that, nagkaroon ng Constitutional Convention. So, itong Constitutional Convention na to, as an event itself, nangyari siya sa Pennsylvania State House na na-mention ko, which is now, of course, the Independence Hall, which is located in Philadelphia particularly. So, ang naging delegates dito were actually a total of 55 men from the 12 states, except nga si Rhode Island kasi hindi siya nagpadala ng sarili niyang delegates. So, it presided over by George Washington kasi siya yung first president ng US at that time. Siya yung nag-head nitong particular event na to, the Constitutional Convention. So, yung goal niya or yung objective niya was to initially revise nga yung Articles of Confederation and improve it in many ways possible. But they ended up creating an entirely new constitution because they felt productive, they felt like the US needed a lot of changes constitutionally, and that's what they did. Okay? So it took them a lot of hours doing it. I think a total of 9 hours ata, correct me if I'm wrong. So the key debates and compromises na nangyari is that the Constitution emerged through intense debates and a lot of sabihin natin hindi naman violent, pero mga outraged uh, voices. Kasi syempre, if we are to look at the representatives from the states, the 12 states back then, itong mga tao na to, they are really interested in having a particular contribution when it comes to the Constitutional Convention. Okay. So, further elaborating, yung naging yung naging sabihin nating most highlighted discussion within the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was number one, pagdating sa representation in Congress. Yung unang na-raise ni George Madison is yung tinatawag na Virginia Plan. Ang pinaka-point nito is that it favored large states representation by population. Meaning, yung mga mas malaking states, mas malaki ang population, it should have more voting capacity or voting seats. On the other hand, si Patterson naman, although hindi siya considered to be as the major founding fathers of America, but a very known catalyst and author back then, he actually raised what we call the New Jersey Plan. Basically, ang point naman ito, it favored small states, equal representation naman. Right? And of course, na-highlight din dito yung tinatawag na Great Compromise na Connecticut Compromise. Okay? So, si Connecticut Compromise, it talks about particularly the bicameral legislature, meaning the House of Rep by population representation and the Senate by equal representation. So another thing that was highlighted in the Constitutional Convention or the CONCON is the slavery. So of course, itong mga founding fathers na to, at the same time the other delegates, most of them, class, are actually pro-slavery or hindi pa sila talaga fully decided or hindi pa sila ganun supportive of equality because during this time slavery was heavily an economic leverage for the United States of America. Hindi pa uso doon ng machineries, hindi pa uso ang technology. So their means of creating buildings, infrastructure, or sabihin natin mga household labor are all majorly dependent on the slaves or the black Americans. So, during the CONCON, they have discussed about the divisive issue, no? The southern states wanted slave people counted for representation. So, yung mga nasa northern states naman resisted. So, yung mga nasa northern states kasi, they are more of heavily practicing of slavery or more supportive of slavery sila. Okay? On the other hand, yung mga southern states naman, mas neoliberal or mas liberal sila in a way that they wanted to encapsulate or they wanted to include the black Americans when it comes to political and economic decisions. So what happened in the discussion of slavery is that there was what we call the 3/5 compromise, meaning 3/5 of enslaved persons counted for both taxation and representation, which we have discussed earlier on. So besides that, slavery also, in the area of slavery, it was also allowed continuation of the slave trade until 1808. Kumbaga, sabi ko nga, their economic practices and status was largely dependent on the slaves. Kaya yung mga pag-trade nila ng mga slaves from one country to another, particularly in Germany, in France, at the same time in Canada, was still practiced until 1808. Right? So besides the slavery or the uh, topics when it comes to compromises or plans, na-highlight din dito again yung na-mention natin about the executive power. They have debated whether to have a single or plural executive. Okay? So at present, of course, they have what we call the executive body, including the president, and where, of course, it heads the state, including the federal states that are involved. So, as a result of their discussion, itong mga delegates na to, a single president was actually decided on. Pero meron siyang limited powers lang. It is limited by the Congress and the judiciary to make sure na hindi siya magkaroon ng overruling capacity. And nagkaroon din na tinatawag na under the executive power, yung kung narinig nyo na, yung electoral college which created a balance to popular vote and state influence. Kumbaga parang mas organized, mas decentralized yung mga voting institutions when it comes to of course selecting the possible president, vice president, and the senators in America. Kumbaga, every time na nagkakaroon ng national election in the US, the voting college or the electoral college are largely represented or counted for. And of course, di natin makakalimutan again, although paulit-ulit na, yung checks and balances. And of course, there should always still be a strong central government. Pero dapat divided into three branches, into the legislative, executive, and judicial. And another point of view is the federalism, in where, of course, shared power between national and state governments should not be forgotten or disregarded. So the signing happened in particularly in September 17, 1787. The final constitution was signed by the 39 of the 55 delegates. Some refused to sign, like nandyan sila George Mason, Edmund Randolph, pati si Elbridge Gerry, due to a lack of Bill of Rights or nahihinaan sila dun sa components ng Bill of Rights. So the document then went to the states for ratification, requiring approval by the 9 of 13 states. So moving on. So papakilala ko na sa inyo yung founders of America and democracy. So these are the following. These 7 men. Okay? So ano bang observation sa kanila? In terms of physical characteristics. So as you can see, they are all white. And with that, you should not expect so much of equality at the same time inclusion when it comes to these men. Because at the end of the day, majority of them are still supportive of slavery, at the same time, slave trade. No? And with that, let's have least expectations towards this man. Kasi even though we're studying politics and governance of America, we're not vying or not we're not sabihin nating disregarding the fact that these founding fathers of America and democracy are flawed in many areas, right? So let's tackle each one by one, right? So magi-start tayo kay Thomas Jefferson. So I won't really delve too much of what they have contributed because it's already widely available to you on the internet. Pero para magkaroon lang kayo ng idea on how they are different from each other, magbibigay ako ng mga distinct contributions nila when it comes to the US Constitution and of course in the American democracy in general. Okay, let's start with Thomas Jefferson. Alright. So si Thomas Jefferson, he is known to be the principal author of the Declaration of Independence ng 1776. So siya yung technically third US president from 1801 to 1809. Pagdating sa contribution niya sa democracy and pagdating sa Constitution or US Constitution, ang pinaka naging contribution niya is what we call the natural rights. So yung natural rights, as mentioned before, it is the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right? So that particular notion na meron siyang sabihin nating bias or support of natural rights, what Thomas Jefferson wanted to embody is that each American citizen, particularly the whites, they could have a particular role and choice when it comes to having that having that freedom of what you want to be in terms of employment, at the same time what type of education you want to choose. So these are things that he believed as very important for every American, because even though you have one national identity as Americans, is people are distinct of their choices and civil positions in the society. So besides that, Thomas Jefferson advocated for what we call the agrarian democracy. And what we mean for agrarian democracy, or tinatawag natin na Jeffersonian democracy, meron siyang meron siyang distrust of the centralized government. Nakita niya kasi yung aftermath of how the Great Britain, particularly in the regime of King George III, have basically exploited or overused his power over the Americans or the colonists, no? So besides that, he also believed he believed in rather, for religious freedom, that each American has their own choice of what particular religion that they want to believe in, or to, uh, let's say, submit themselves in. So, yung religious freedom, minanifest or in-institutionalize niya yan through what we call the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom of 1786, which basically lets the 13 states, to have their own choice of religion. But it's not limited to the states choosing one religion for all its people, but rather, all the people have their own individual choices when it comes to religion. Because Thomas Jefferson believed that religion is something that is very internal, very personal, and should not be collectively decided upon. Alright, so another contribution or another very important role by Thomas Jefferson is, again, we go back to his Declaration of Independence. Kasi nga, siya yung siya yung technically siya yung principal author nito. So he asserted that the fundamental democratic principle that governments should have is that, quote unquote, it should derive their power from the consent of the governed. Meaning the people should always have the final say when it comes to who, what, and how the country should govern. Okay? Meaning yung democratic ideals niya of eradicating the central government through his agrarian democracy or Jeffersonian democracy is what manifested in his Declaration of Independence. Okay, besides that, Thomas Jefferson, in his Declaration of Independence, he announced that yung separation of the 13 North American British colonies should be strengthened or institutionalized. Meaning, since he was against centralization, yung last series of steps niya dun sa may Declaration of Independence is that how they could, as a nation, liberalize the 13 states from the Great Britain. Okay? So moving forward, we now delve on or tackle James Madison. So si James Madison naman is considered to be or quoted as the father of the Constitution. So si James Madison, siya actually yung fourth US President from 1809 to 1817. So yung contribution niya when it comes to the US Constitution and democracy is he is also a principal author of the US Constitution 1787, and particularly the Bill of Rights of 1791, take note, sobrang halaga nung Bill of Rights. Kasi pagdating sa US Constitution, it is believed to be the actual umbrella. Kasi dito pumapasok yung core foundation na sinabi ni Thomas Jefferson. So, in relation to Thomas Jefferson, syempre nagkaroon sila ng ng collaboration when it comes to writing the US Constitution. So, he actually wrote or co-wrote what we call the Federalist Papers. This is James Madison. Yung tinatawag na Federalist Papers, ito yung nag-define actually nung checks and balances and federalism for the US Constitution. Meaning, pinakita dito sa may Federalist Papers on how the three branches of government could basically check among themselves, limit themselves when it comes to their practice of powers and roles. And also, tinignan din ng Federalist Papers on how the federalism in terms of the 13 states should still, at the end of the day, be centralized in the executive body of government of the United States. Kumbaga dapat hindi nalalayo or hindi na disattach yung mga 13 states from its central government. So besides that, James Madison also advocated for the protection of what we call the individual rights against federal overreach. Meaning, pag sinabi nating individual rights, is we're talking about the individuals or the locals or the citizens themselves. Is that at the end of the day, kahit merong independent federal decisions ang mga US states, is that at the end of the day, they are entitled to their own freedom of choosing their own religion, their own education, their own employment, and whatsoever. So meron silang huge alignment talaga ni Thomas Jefferson. Bakit ba siya tinawag na, again, si James Madison, bakit ba siya tinawag na Father of the Constitution? Tinawag siya na Father of the Constitution kasi siya yung key architect ng Bill of Rights. Pag sinabi natin key architect ng Bill of Rights at the same time ng US Constitution is in-ensure niya na yung democratic principles were embedded in the nation's legal framework. Kumbaga, sinolidify at the same time in-ensure niya na kada clause, kada sub-clause is it embodies democratic principles. Kumbaga parang ang role niya was to really check, to ensure that everything that is indicated in the Constitution is democratically weighing. Okay? So lastly, Madison or James Madison, nag-advocate siya again dun sa tinatawag natin na pag-comply dun sa idea ni Montesquieu of the separation of powers. I think si James Madison kasi is a huge fan of Montesquieu or tinatawag siya na Montesquieuan in a way that talagang minanifest niyo yung yung separation of powers within the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights itself. Kaya rin siya considered na Father of the Constitution kasi he is believed to be someone who really looks at the the avoidance of the overreach or the over practice of power in one centralized body. So next would be we have here George Washington. So as you know, George Washington is the first president of the United States of America. So si George Washington, as you recall, dun sa may topic natin sa may American Revolution, considered siya or termed siya as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army of the US states, no? So, napatunayan niya yung sarili niya, particularly dun sa may Battle of Lexington and Concord, pati dun sa may Battle of Saratoga, no? And where, of course, the United States have finally won sa may Saratoga together with the intervention of the French army or government. So, si George Washington, he was the first US president from 1789 to 1797. So, pagdating sa contribution niya, he actually symbolized or he's basically supported the idea of unity and Republican leadership. Pag sinabi nating unity and Republican leadership is that at the end of the day, what he wanted to imbibe is that the three branches of government, together with, of course, the federal government, should have a unified decision when it comes to national policies, when it comes to foreign policies, and at the same time, pagdating sa national security. And with that, he strengthened that particular notion by making sure that the people would have a proper choice or a systemized choice in choosing their rightful leader. Kaya malakas ang protection ni George Washington when it comes to suffrage. Because he believed that the autonomy, the decision should always come from the people and not just from the government. Right? So, ang other contribution ni George Washington, he believed that since dapat nanggagaling sa sa tao or sa madla ang pagpili ng leader, he refused the practice of kingship or pagiging hari. At the same time, yung tinatawag natin na hereditary government or yung pagpapasa ng government from one family to another. But instead, he set that concept of elected leadership as mentioned. Right. So, ano pa ba? Another contribution by George Washington is he established what we call yung two-term limit, no? Pag sinabi natin two-term limit is you could just be a president for 2 terms. Pero later on, na-codified siya in the 22nd Amendment. Right? So, kilala si George Washington as a famous military leader because of his contribution in the American Revolution. So, Washington played a crucial role in the establishment of a democratic republic. So, he was also a very, sabihin nating, peaceful and democratic individual. Naniniwala siya sa, sa democratic relations or sa mga democratic uh, practices like diplomatic simulations, diplomatic negotiations, and whatsoever. Okay? Ang ironic, no, pero nag-engage naman siya sa Battle of Saratoga, pati sa Lexington and Concord. So, yung mga sinusuportahan na ideologies ni ni Washington rather, it revolves on the principles of freedom, autonomy, pati liberty. Itong mga particular principles na to are basically the foundations of, again, the American Constitution. But not only the Constitution, but also the social identity. No? So dito nag-start talaga yung foregrounds ng tatlong areas or principles na to dito kay George Washington as the first US President. Okay, next we have Alexander Hamilton, which you are all familiar of, especially at napanood niyo yung, hindi ko lang kung napanood niyo yung musical na Hamilton. So basically, ninarrate doon yung buong buhay ni Alexander Hamilton from a young teenage boy up to when he became the first Secretary of the Treasury or became the co-author of what we call the Federalist Papers. So, itakal natin kung ano ba yung naging important roles and contributions ni Alexander Hamilton. Okay. So, si Alexander Hamilton, as mentioned, he was the co-author of the Federalist Papers. So, yung Federalist Papers na to, actually, it is a series of remarkable essays. Ang pinaka-kinocontain nito is basically how he critically, at the same time, divisively, provided ratifications on the document of New York, as well as the rest of the nation. Kumbaga, nagpakita siya ng mga or nagsulat siya ng mga series of essays that would basically improve the country in terms of its federal structure. Pagdating sa federal structure, it talked about the constitutional foundation, the leadership mechanism, at the same time, yung mga fiscal, pati yung mga economic decisions that transcend within the federalist type of government. So, sobrang dami ng essay na kinreate or sinulat niya. Right? So, besides that, yung paniniwala ni Alexander Hamilton, even based on the musical or the film Hamilton, he advocated for a strong central government, no, to stabilize the union. Kumbaga, he believed that the central government would basically lead to better national order. But that particular strong government should be checked, should be monitored, not only by the branches of government, the judicial and the legislative, but also by the people themselves. Okay? So another thing that Hamilton also promulgated or supported is the designed financial system. Particularly, kanina na-mention ko, he wrote in his essays how he wanted to fix the financial or fiscal system of the United States. So, naniwala siya na with a strong financial system that is incorporating of national bank and credit system, this actually would create a better economic democracy. Kaya yung ano niya, yung Federalist Papers niya, it highlights more of the state of New York is dito centered kasi dati yung banking system, pati yung credit system of America. Kaya dito sa may 13 or dun sa may ginawa niyang mga essays na Federalist Papers, na-criticize niya or na-highlight niya how New York and of course some of the other states could adopt that systemized national and banking system that should be monitored by the government or could be co-owned by the government. Parang lumalabas dito, ito yung Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, no? So, besides that, ano pa ba? He also believed or Hamilton believed that there should be checks against popular excess but supported constitutional order. So he also believed in checks and balances na dapat meron tayong capacity to monitor the three branches of government, lalo yung executive body, which is dyan kasi centralized yung leadership through the president and the cabinet members. So, um, besides that, again, since he is called as the Federalist, syempre, believer siya ng federal government. Tumulong si Hamilton or nag-advocate si Hamilton to lay the groundwork for the democratic institutions, no? When it comes to the balance of power between the federal government and the state. Okay? So last one for this slide, we have Benjamin Franklin. Alright, so Benjamin Franklin. So si Benjamin Franklin, um, among these five founders of America that you could see on this slide, si Benjamin Franklin siya yung maraming hats na sinusuot. Meaning, marami siyang roles or marami siyang trabaho na meron or ganap. So si Benjamin Franklin, he is a diplomat, he is an inventor, he is an elder statesman, and of course, he is involved in the Constitutional Convention. So si Benjamin Franklin, when it comes to his contribution, he advocated on what we call the compromise. Pag sinabi natin compromise is that uh, it has been seen or it has been considered as the key or the solution in uniting the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. Remember kanina, we have tackled na merong 55 delegates itong Constitutional Convention. So, ang ginawa ni Benjamin Franklin is that he made sure that each of the representatives, they were informed about what we call the compromise. Meaning, it is a peaceful mean in where they should unite, they should let each other speak up or talk about the problems of their own state. At pagdating sa compromise, literal na kompromiso, if that there will be adjustments when it comes to the collective decisions, when it comes to the Constitutional Convention, that will be applied to the US Constitution. Kasi may possibility naman talaga na in terms of territorial boundaries, when it comes to economic implementations, is magkakaroon talaga ng conflict with one state to another. So si Benjamin Franklin, as a diplomat and a peaceful guy himself, he made sure na walang mangyayaring conflict between these particular delegates. Pero in reality, meron pa rin namang nangyaring conflict or sabihin nating pagkakainitan between the delegates. Pero si Benjamin Franklin lang yung nag-serve as the mediator during that time. So besides that, si Benjamin Franklin, he also championed for what we call the freedom of speech, press, and civic participation. As a diplomat himself, he really supported the whole idea that the Constitution should strongly highlight these particular areas of freedom because the Constitution or the area of democracy would not be possible if the people would just be silenced or will not be involved in the participation aspect of the national government. Okay, besides that, ano pa ba? So, given that Benjamin Franklin is a diplomat, malaki kasi yung role niya as a diplomat of the state. Na-secure niya yung alliance with the French government. Kumbaga, during the French Revolution, na-make sure niya na parang during that time, since ina-eradicate nila yung ina-eradicate ng French government yung regime ni King Louis XVI, pati nung family niya, is stable pa rin or ongoing pa rin yung alliance or yung proper kinship between these two countries. And he would then later on visit France to meet the actual revolutionaries there and talk about the progress that they have made during the revolution. So next, besides having that democratic ideals at the same time, securing the alliance with the French government and having that mediator role when it comes to the compromise aspect of the constitutional convention. Pagdating sa Enlightenment period, si Benjamin Franklin, he really believed in science and reason. That's why isa siyang considered inventor. Si Franklin nag-advocate siya nag-advocate siya ng civic virtue and political activism. So, as a scientist and as a diplomat and a sabihin nating social entrepreneur himself, si Benjamin Franklin, he was a good sabihin nating equalizer or he was a good balancer of science and sociology as both concepts applying to the US Constitution. Right, so we have the last two founders of America and democracy, who are, of course, John Adams and John Jay. So, let's start first with John Adams. So, si John Adams, medyo nakakalbo na siya, no? Konti na lang yung nasa gitna. So, si John Adams was considered to be a revolutionary leader, at the same time similar to Benjamin Franklin. He was also a diplomat, and he was the second U.S. president after George Washington from 1797 to 1801. So pagdating sa role ni John Adams as a revolutionary leader and of course a diplomat himself, he basically largely contributed to what we call the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. So the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, it is actually one of the earliest constitutions that was established with a clear distinction of the separation of powers. Meaning, na-define na niya or nasulat niya na dito sa may Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 kung ano ba yung mga primary role or distinctive role ng each of the three branches of government. And that applies to the Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, government at that time. As you know, sa Massachusetts, dito located yung Harvard University. Meron siyang statue actually in Harvard University in where he highlighted or dito nakalagay yung Massachusetts Constitution or isa yun sa mga foreground of his contributions. So besides that, he also promoted the idea of balanced republic, meaning he believed in the separation of the executive body, the bicameral legislature or the Congress that we call it, and of course the judiciary. Okay? But besides all of this contribution of his, pagdating sa separation of powers or balanced republic, he embodied that particular advocacy of making America purely independent from the rule of Great Britain. Because growing up, John Adams with his family have actually suffered and experienced the bad implications of the Great Britain regime, particularly in the King George III regime. So nakita niya how exploiting at the same time how unfree the America was during his time. And lastly, we have here John Jay. So si John Jay naman, he is the first Chief of Justice of the Supreme Court under the judicial body of the three branches of government. He is also the diplomat of the US. Before, naging diplomat din siya, similar to Adams and Franklin. And he is one of the co-author ni Alexander Hamilton ng The Federalist Papers. So, dalawa sila na talagang nag-focus when it comes to the Federalist Papers. So, ano ba naging contribution ni John Jay? So, besides being one of the co-author of Federalist Papers, kasi ang nagsulat talaga more of sa Federalist Papers ay si Alexander Hamilton. More of si John Jay. Kumbaga si John Jay parang nag-contribute lang siya ng ilang clauses, ilang statements, pero si Alexander Hamilton talaga yung nag-provide ng most of the statements about how they could establish a better federal republic type of government. So, one naging contributions niya was to negotiate for the Treaty of Paris of 1783, as you may recall. So, the 1783 Treaty of Paris technically ended the battle between the British and the American forces. With this treaty, it ended the Revolutionary War. So, he talked to the British officials and the British government about what particular repercussions and what particular adjustments shall be done once the Revolutionary War ended. Okay? So, as Chief of Justice of the Supreme Court, or the first Chief of Justice, he strengthened or he maximized the capacity of the judiciary as an independent branch. Kumbaga siya yung nag-clarify why the judicial branch should have a separate role compared to the executive and legislative bodies. Because he believed that as the first Chief of Justice is that the judicial branch should just only be in charge of interpreting the laws, no? Rather than making or deciding for it. Kasi dapat ang in charge dyan ay si executive pati si more of si legislative bodies. Lastly, John Jay advocated federal unity under the Constitution. Meaning, he believed that even though the judiciary is representing of the identity of the whole nation, is that at the end of the day, all of the states should have a particular consultation and involvement when it comes to the judicial decisions that is made in the judicial branch. Okay? So we are done with the lesson and discussion of the founders of America and democracy. I hope you learned something from the discussion, from having the Articles of Confederation, and of course shifting into Constitutional Convention, and of course the contributions of the seven founders of American democracy, and most importantly, how you could analyze or how you could basically partake in the idea or in the whole landscape of defining American democracy. So, see you next meeting for our next assessment covering this